Greetings, everyone. Welcome on Discord.
Greetings, everyone.
Oh dear, I have an echo.
On Discord.
Greetings, everyone. Oh dear. Let's see if that's working. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Yep, I am on Twitch, YouTube, Discord, and TikTok. So if you want to join anywhere, you are welcome to join there. So, just a little bit of context. This is the book that I am reading. There's a huge trigger warning. Huge, because this is a difficult book. This is specifically about rape in a South African context. I will not be censoring my language. I do not censor my language when I talk about these kinds of things because this is important to understand that the language matters. And so if you do not want to be part of these conversations, you are welcome to listen in your own time. Recordings will be available. And yeah, let's go. Hi, Gonzo. Welcome. We need to organize our meeting. Unfortunately, this week. Understandable, Loot Goblin. Good night. I love you. Thank you for the tea. You're handsome. He's looking at me grumpily and closing the door. It would have been smooth if the rhino didn't thwart you. Oh. Yes. Let's catch up another time. It is a very difficult book. It is it's difficult to hear the truths about rape in South Africa because yes, we do have one of the highest rape rates in the world. And we are also known as the femicide capital of the world. So it's difficult. But we are on chapter 3, page 54. If you are following along, the chapter is on ruling violence. So this was quite a while ago. When was this book published? This is a first edition. So it was 2015. 21 years ago, South Africa had its first democratic election. And as a country that is particularly fond of milestones, we are reminded ourselves repeatedly of the significance of the 27th of April 1994. The 21st year of South Africa's democracy also presents an opportunity to reflect on the many ways in which the country we live in differs from the one we left behind. It also offers metaphoric maturity to reflect on failures, limitations, and disappointments we have gone through, as it becomes clearer that many aspects of our democracy need to be revisited if we are to move forward to a country we all want to live in. 21 years on, violence continues to retain a strong grip in our lives that postpones the attainment of the kind of free society we so optimistically awaited in 1994. The saturation of our lives with violence is a legacy of unfinished pasts and is evidence of emboldening forms of violence enabled in post-apartheid South Africa. It is no longer enough to say that this is better than apartheid. Almost anything is better than apartheid. Hi, Taro. Welcome. The boys in hell and we're limbo dancing with the devil. Anything is better than apartheid. And when people say, especially white South African expatriates, and I was talking about this earlier, white South African expatriates who are like, oh, things are so bad in South Africa, you can't walk in the streets, you can't do this, you can't do that, the economy is falling apart, yada, 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 blah, 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 yakety, schmackety. They are talking shit when they say that things were better under apartheid. They are talking absolute crap. Because anything even the fascism under which the US is living now is better than apartheid. Loosening the stranglehold on violence is going to require fewer excuses and more imagination. And now, reading this book now, it is 31 years on from our first democratic election. And I am glad to say that quite a bit has changed in terms of the grip that violence has on the country. Because we now have a sexual offences court. We now have trans rights within the court system. And I'm very proud to have been part of those dialogues. We now have a mandate for controlling gender-based violence, which also very proud to have been part of formatting and drafting those policies. We still have a long way to go. In 2018, we marched to Parliament, to the Union buildings, to our Supreme Court, our Supreme Court of Appeal, our Constitutional Court, all over the country. Almost 2 million women and femmes marched collectively and handed over a memorandum of demands to the people who can make the biggest difference. And ever since then, we have had the annual gender-based violence action campaign organized by the presidency, where we sit down and we have dialogues on how we can change policy and how we can enact certain policies. Lived experiences of women have changed, I wouldn't say drastically, but fundamentally for the better. And it can only get better the more we do this kind of work. So 10 years on from the time this book was written, yes, we have gotten better. We're still not where we need to be. South Africa is still very much in the grips of patriarchy. And that is going to take a lot longer to undo. Because we can have policy, we can have sexual offense courts, we can have dedicated presidential task teams to address gender-based violence. However, none of that will make a difference in people's lives. Thank you, Kiki. None of that will make a difference in people's lives and lived experiences and material realities if we don't have the means to enforce it, and if we don't have the impetus from the public to actually change the way in which patriarchy functions in our society. In 2015, the cracks are clear. There have been 2 explosions of violence against Africans and South Asians who are assumed not to hold legitimate South African passports. Both these events have shaken us to the core as a society. Thank you. Even as we continue to disagree passionately about what they reveal about us. Should we call such attacks xenophobia? And if we do, what do they illustrate about our relationships to ourselves, blackness, the continent, and the value of human life in South Africa? It's fine. I like the little celebration. It's important to understand that we inherited a system of violence. We inherited a system of such violence that was rooted not just in apartheid, but in colonialism before the institution of apartheid itself. Our relationships to ourselves as a country has always been rooted in ideological, physical, mental, emotional violence. And so how do we tear ourselves away from that? I always go back to Frantz Fanon's, the best question he ever asked in all of his theory is, how do we extricate ourselves? And We can from this. We can extricate ourselves from colonial violence with time. We haven't gotten there yet because we have intrinsically, our country was built upon the function, the very real function of extractionism, where human life was devalued right from the get-go. So how do you start valuing human life in a country that was built on the lack of it? Especially black and brown lives. We'll probably not agree anytime soon about what these explosions of violence against those deemed foreigners mean. I know that as I continue to write about the spectacle of burning, broken bodies of those quote-unquote safe to violate, we are seeing the retention of gendered, classed, and racial violence that is so connected to many other patterns of belonging and interaction in South Africa that we view as normal. Gendered violence is normal because gendered violence was normalized. Racialized violence was normalized. Class violence has always been normalized. It is so normal to just read about a homeless person who was knocked over by a car in a hit and run and go, okay, oh well. But give that person a house, an occupation, a name, preferably a white face, and see how that changes. Hi, Jen B. Good to see you. We have to ask ourselves, who do we view as expendable and who benefits? It's easy to see the young men who attack and kill foreigners in the street as pathological, to pretend if we say that they're criminals, their actions are not political. In fact, the behavior of their actions is also not political. The behavior of economically marginal young men has everything to do with all of us, regardless of how we live. Their behavior is not out of step with the high levels of gendered violence, from rape to sexual harassment to intimate femicide. It is also not separate from the orientation of South African capital to the rest of the continent, and indeed the world. I have developed both of these arguments of how typically South African these N-word phobic violence is in my writing elsewhere, and I will therefore not do so here. Anti-black violence, as I will call it from now on, because I will not use the N-word. Anti-black violence has always been a facet of our society that we've never had to reckon with up until now. So how do we reckon with it? How do we reckon with a society that is so okay with that kind of violence that we cannot envision a society without that kind of violence? That when you ask people, how do we fix this and what do you see for the future, their mind goes blank, because we cannot imagine our world with this kind of violence. And here we need to read especially two books. And I've forgotten the name of the one. It is in the server, in the library. It is Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, and Black Power, The Politics of Liberation in America. I would also like for people to read Madness and Civilization, because, it kind of goes into the psyche of quote-unquote civilization. In the 21st year of our democracy, we have also survived the Marikana tragedy and continue to await the release of the report of another moment in deep collective trauma as miners were shot down. It was the biggest massacre since, this was in 2012, the biggest massacre since the Sharpeville massacre in the 60s. What happened in Marikana was that miners were striking for a fairer wage, and the police were called in. 34 people were killed. We still haven't received justice for those 34 people killed. And our current president was the one to give the order to the police commissioner to quote-unquote mow them down. Because whose bodies matter? If they're not being broken, essentially slaving away in mine shafts, then they were expendable. In a sequence of events played out to increasingly disbelieving audiences, the shootings at Marikana were punctuated by explanations that created more mystification than clarity. Rehat Desai's brilliant film, Miners Shot Down, bravely cuts through the smoke and mirrors. President Jacob Zuma's June 2015 release of the Farlam Commission on Marikana reports 3 months after he received it, did little to assuage the public disillusionment with the lack of accountability. This is especially so given the exoneration of all political figures involved. It was disgusting. It is now 10 years later since that the Farlam Commission report. As well as the apportioning of blame for all the deaths from the Marikana massacre to the striking miners themselves. As we approach the 40th anniversary of the June 16 student uprising, radical student movements like Rhodes Must Fall show us the failure of previous projects to transform South Africa's universities. This is all also happening against the backdrop of a crumbling public education system. The young people of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, along with their comrades in allied movements like Fees Must Fall, are impatient with not just the slow pace of transformation at universities, but the continuing violence against black people in these spaces. And just a reminder, when Pumla in these books talks about black people with a capital B, she's talking about politically black. That includes all people of color in South Africa, because that's what the political definition of black is in this country. A legacy of colonialism and apartheid. Joy. The romance of a new country is gone, and the children that should have inherited Mandela's dream continue to live under the brutalization of racialized, gendered terror. Their strategies and rage are not entirely different from the energy, anger, and hope that we associate with the Soweto 1976 student uprising. As we celebrate and commemorate, reflect on milestones during our liberation timeline, Soweto 1976 reminds us of how actively contested education and language once were, and how important it is not to take activities in these spheres for granted. What happened in Soweto in 1976? These students rose up against the Bantu Education Act, and more than 200 of them were killed by police. These were peacefully protesting students, unarmed, chanting in the streets of Soweto, and they were gunned down by apartheid police. when the black staff at the University of Cape Town who organized under Transform UCT insisted on curriculum change, they drive home the failure of the transformation agenda and the urgency of unapologetically decolonizing universities. We have been talking about decolonizing education for years. These are strong statements against institutional violence, often met with criminalization and violence that should not be the norm 21 years after 94. The government always responds the only way it knows how: sending in the National Guard. Oh, tell me. Please explain. Decolonizing education is something that I am incredibly passionate about. I am all for rewriting entire syllabi. We are also 18 months away from the 60th anniversary of the Women's March in the Union buildings, protesting the extension of passes to black women. 10 years ago, I was privy to the words of one of the march's leaders, Sophia Williams de Bruyn, as she addressed various audiences, which included the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research's Women's Day breakfast in Tshwane on 8 August, an address before the Lillian Ngoyi Memorial Lecture at the University of South Africa on the 25th, and her address at the commemorative march of the 50th anniversary of the Women's March on 9th August. It really is. It's so interesting, and I would actually like to talk about it further. You can add me on Discord. That is the easiest way to talk. All my links are in my bio. And don't forget, I do have this here goal, because a bitch is struggling. Of course. What happened on the 9th of August? Yeah. Yeah, drop me a message. What was I saying? Oh yes, the 9th of August. Women marched to the Union buildings, protesting the passbook laws, what was called the Dompas, the passbook that was needed to travel or move freely with the permission of the white man in certain spaces. If you didn't have your Dompas, you were arrested, beaten up, or killed. With Sophia Williams de Bruyn, we reflected how tall South Africa's women stand in history, and on the reality that defiance was no stranger to them. So at a time where there were no cellular phones and moving up and down the country was heavily policed, 20,000 women made it to the planned Women's March. As she, then Deputy Speaker of the Gauteng Legislature, reminded us, many were sidetracked, detained, and barred from entering in various ways. Had this not been so, we would have known more accurately how many women left their homes for that historic march. Or historic. Given this example of women's political organization, it's particularly troubling to reflect on the epidemic of violence against women: rape, femicide, public attacks, stripping, routine sexual harassment. Women like Nandi Mzibane who disappear from their homes without a trace, or like Constable Rasuge, who get murdered by intimate partners and whose remains are discovered years later. Women like Kwezi, once exiled for laying a charge of rape against a powerful man who subsequently rose to the nation's highest office, and decreasing reports of rape to the police, which suggest decreasing confidence in the possibility of justice for rape survivors. Hi B. It's almost a decade since the Jacob Zuma rape trial. This is what 1 in 9 activists were reminding those who participated in the celebratory march by the ANC Women's League in August 2012. Carrying a banner with the words, "No cause for celebration," and staging a die-in that crossed the paths of the ANC Women's League marches, these feminist activists were reminding them, many of them powerful women in government and in the majority party, of a huge gap between the country's gender legislation and women's experiences of living under siege from gendered violence. In 2006, we were also invited to cast our mind's eyes to the anniversary of the 1906 Bambata rebellion or uprising against enforced colonial poll tax, to ponder what it means to be closing our second decade since the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in East London in 1996. Set theory? Please remind me. Celebrating almost 20 years of our Constitution, a founding document that allows us to project an image of our society as we would be if we were our best selves. In this way, the Constitution is an aspirational document. To borrow Hombi Bamba's 2002 phrase, just like Bishop Tutu's naming of us as the rainbow people of God was aspirational. This labeling of South Africans as the rainbow nation, similar to the provisions of the Constitution, would bring us closer to the society described in both. The labels were aspirational because they gave hope, a hope that sometimes feels like it is in danger of permanently slipping away. It feels so tenuous and fragile. To have hope, especially in a time like this, feels so precarious. I always want to have hope. It just feels like catching a butterfly and curling your fingers around it. One wrong move and you can crush it. That's what having hope feels like right now. It is true. It is true. The Constitution as a project describes how we should relate to one another, what we should be able to assume and invest in one another, what embracing and accepting that all are entitled to freedom really means. So it doesn't just hold thoughts, ideologies, values, or morals of the majority of South Africans. It is aspirational because it defines us generously as our best selves. Yeah, I keep on saying the Constitution is bulletproof, but our people aren't. And we still get killed in racialized, gendered class violence. In ways that dramatically move away from the manifold forms of legislated and institutionalized oppression under the chaotic nightmare that became apartheid, as Achille Mbembe might say, the Constitution positions us as a freedom-loving and just people who would have freedom enjoyed by all. As one of the late Nadine Gordimer's characters in her 1998 novel, The House Gun, says, it's a document of what should be, a collective morality of all people. It is fitting that all these anniversaries coincide with the second decade of writing the Constitution, because this allows us to reflect upon the ways in which we think about our past and our future. Absolutely, Everett. 100%. Let me explain. When national anniversaries come to us in isolation, by which I mean one per year rather than the cluster that South Africans were presented with in 2006, and as we will in 2016, We can well be forgiven for playing up the peculiarity of specialness of that particular event, airbrushing the larger context out. So 12 years ago, as we celebrated 10 years since our first democratic election, we arguably have never been more vocal about how far we'd come. So we were self-congratulatory and perhaps relieved or relived how we felt when we cast the first vote in April 1994. The euphoria we felt for the remainder of that year. We enjoyed the fact that none of the naysayers and prophets of doom had been right about the fate of our country post-liberation. Young artists working in all genres seemed to intensify the production of a South African aesthetic, cheeky, unapologetically mixed as it drew from inspiration from wherever it saw fit. So it became Afro-chic, Mokwaito, Afropop, Mzansi, and so on. Focusing on such beautiful moments from our past and how well we had taken to hard-won freedom, it makes sense that we had a year-long party, as we should. The 28th of April 1994 had to be declared a public holiday after our voting day, our first voting day, because everybody was fucking hungover. And then they gave us the rest of the week off. This was very unusual. We just had the rest of the week off. It was just like, yeah, don't bother coming to work. Don't bother going to school. Nobody's going to anyway. It is the drunkest I have ever seen my mother. It is the most emotional I have seen my father. Let me tell you a story after I read this section. At the same time, that is beauty of having only one anniversary in a year. Yeah, the 27th of April is a special day. So now I'm going to tell you. 1994, I was 10 years old. Mandela had been released 4 years earlier. He was released on my 6th birthday. I was very upset that I woke up and people were watching TV instead of wishing me happy birthday. And then I saw what was happening. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, Mandela's more important. Cool. Not really understanding what it truly meant for the country to have Mandela walk free out of Pollsmoor prison and seeing him take those steps hand in hand with his then wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and lifting his fist into the air. That is a famous picture of him taking his first steps out into freedom after 27 years in prison. Yeah, I am Taro. We had 4 years of violence in the townships. It wasn't violence as like you would see, you would imagine, nobody was able to exist within those spaces. It was violence in that it was warring political factions more than racialized violence. It was warring political factions in the apartheid government's attempt to destabilize the townships, the places in which the majority of black people in the country lived. And so you have 4 years of township violence. You have a tentative look to the future as our flag is being redesigned, as our constitution is being written, as everything, the stage is being set for a new South Africa, as we were told it would be. I remember the morning of the 27th. Special voting started on the 26th, especially for the elderly and disabled people. On the morning of the 27th, my dad took my hand and he said, We're going to vote. We walked into that polling station. He gripped my hand so tight, and he greeted an officer with a familiarity, a white officer, with this familiarity that was kind of unsettling. And I was wondering, what on God's green earth is going on here? He took me through the entire voting process. The lady at the polling station, she had some torn ballot sheets. And she's like, we're keeping all of these just in case the kids want to take part. And so she didn't stamp them, and she wrote void on the top so that the counters knew not to count them. They had a whole process. They inked my nail so that you put your thumb under the UV light. They could tell that you've already voted, just in case the system has failed. And I put my cross. You have to cross the ballot sheet. I put my X next to Mandela's face. And I watched my father do the same. And as soon as he folded up that ballot paper to put it in the ballot box, I folded up mine, and I had to put mine in a separate ballot box that said trash. So I put mine in what was our little kiddie's ballot box, and my dad put his ballot into the actual ballot box. He sighed. There was the sigh of like, this was years in the making. This was something that he would have given up his life to defend, and he fought for, in thinking that he would never see the day. So when people don't vote, I get angry. Of course I do. But when people disparage how far we've come, I also get angry. Yes, we can always do better. But this is a country that I am so invested in, because it was fought for so ardently, with nothing but hope, faith, and love behind every single march, every single protest, every single campaign. Every single campaign of disobedience, every single arrest. Every single time we looked to the window and thought, Dad hasn't come home yet. Mum's been talking to that police officer for way too long. It was only years later that I found out that police officer that my dad greeted at the polling station was the same officer who had arrested him years before. And when my dad came out of the polling station that day, he smiled at him. That's all he did. He didn't say any nasty words. He didn't disparage him or anything like that. He just smiled. And he walked away. And that's why I keep fighting. That's why I will always keep fighting. "2006 was different, And the multiple anniversaries did not just mean we were much busier. The coincidence of multiple historical markings meant that our feelings and thoughts from the various anniversaries overlapped. We thought about 16th June in relation to present legal language protections, the tensions around mother tongue instruction and the school system, and now, a decade later, the uprisings at university campuses. We could not divorce the student uprisings from the drawing up of the Constitution or from the TRC, the Women's March, the Bambata Rebellion, the assassination of Mozambican President Samora Machel and his colleagues. A year such as this reminded us how much has been fought for over centuries in order for us to enjoy the freedoms we have now. How people have bled, fled, sacrificed, and how many others rebelled, fought, planned. 2006 drove home that much still needs to be fought for, that as brilliantly spectacular as 94 and 2004 were, freedoms still need to be attained and defended. It became apparent then, as we allowed various formative historical moments to rub against one another, encircle one another, and overlap, that our history could not be a timeline, and that the continuity shifted and returned to us with new implications each time. The most striking thread that links all of these events is the fighting presence of violence. The Bambata and June 76 uprising pitched defiance, self-assertion, and brutal violence against one another. On the one hand, there were people refusing to be subjected to increasing legal institutionalized oppression. On the other was local colonial and apartheid state machinery that responded with brute force. The Bambata uprising and the warriors defended themselves against colonial brutality, and so it is true in many anti-colonial conflicts, violence became both the onslaught and self-defense. The TRC offered us another chance to look at ways in which violence permeated otherwise very different aspects of South Africa's society by opening up our long historical consciousness or long memory collective self, as Guyanese poet Grace Nichols might say. Please do yourself a favor and read Grace Nichols. Slavery and colonialism were rooted in violence and violation, in the negation of lives and tearing apart of families, the ingraining of self-hate. That is important to understand. It was not just the enslavement of people for no pay. It was violence against the body, it was violence against the mind, it was the installation of self-hate as a form of existence. Self-defense in the face of colonization also found expression as taking up arms, leading to centuries of warfare across the breadth of the African continent and later the African world, as we call the diaspora today. Building on this, apartheid capitalized on physical violence of contestation through militaristic control and the structural violence of the economy, systematically brutalizing black and brown people through various forms of impoverishment, displacement, disenfranchisement, and military occupation. Apartheid also ensured that white South Africans were heavily armed through the enforced conscription that helped prop up apartheid South Africa and maintain low-level wars between state and comrades. Given the patriarchal structure of both black and white societies in South Africa, this high militarization could only take on gendered forms and play itself out in sharply gendered lines, and children were socialized into societies that were constituted by violent interaction in their very fabric. Even the playground was not free from the scourge of violence and militarism, as evidenced by popular boy and girl scout troops in black communities, or flet and vlei holidays in teenage Afrikaans settings. Felt, the field, vlei, meat, the field and meat. The failure to dismantle what Jacqueline Koch calls the ideology of militarism in a new South Africa is directly implicated in what ails post-apartheid South Africa. It is the silence around connections between accepting the ever-presence of violence as a given on one hand and the absence of discussions around how it affects us as a society on the other, and it continues to trouble. When we take violence as a constant companion in our midst, but one we pretend is invisible, we can only continue to live in a messy state. That's important. Do we acknowledge the violence? Do we face it head on? Do we pretend that it's invisible so we can get to work for one more day? This ideology of militarism requires the same kind of rigor to dismantle as other forms of control, so silence and denial are not a way out. Given its pervasiveness, it finds expression in the academic, business, and NGO sectors, in culture, language, entertainment, and government institutions. It's often hidden under the epithet of discipline in the broad left, when refusal to adhere to certain precepts are often seen as the absence of it. One of the problems with this concept of discipline, which seeks to repress interiority in favor of outwardly visible manifestations of order, is that it helps to mask repressive systems that work to support the ideology of militarism. And that is so important. And it's something that I say on panels quite often. Just because you're saying something nicely, it doesn't mean that you are not violent in what you are saying. Just because you're saying something softly, it doesn't mean you are not being disrespectful. When people say, "Oh, I've been so respectful, I haven't raised my voice," you haven't raised your voice, but you have dehumanized me with every word you've said. Is that not disrespectful? And this is how ruling violence works. I still have quite a bit to go in this chapter. Let me get to where does the idea change? I'm on page 61. I'll go to page 67. And I'll stop there. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission offered us various windows into how violence and silence work through the ambit of discipline. Much has been written about what was said, sayable, and difficult to articulate at the TRC. Tenjiwe Mtsinso has commented on the difficulty of speaking about sexual abuse that women activists suffered at the hands of the state and some of their comrades. At the same time, she criticized how silence protected women who acted on behalf of the apartheid state and violated the human rights of others, as Ntamiseng Motseme's stellar and groundbreaking work on women's testimonies and voices at the TRC has shown. The mute always speak. That in itself is telling. There's something that I always say. When somebody says, "Oh, I want to be a voice for the voiceless." No, there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's absolutely no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the purposefully silenced, the deliberately silenced. The mute always speak, so that the effects of silence and silencing are not always the wishing away of what cannot be spoken. Today we have a constitution that affirms women's dignity and rights to full humanity. At the same time, there are silences and gaps on gender dimensions of the past. These silences are directly implicated in the siege under which we live now, in continued dominance of violence across different areas of South African life. The situation is sometimes referred to as the puzzling South African contradiction, and when so labeled, it's often by those who claim to find the situation impossible to explain or account for. Perhaps the better way to arrive at this core of the mystery is the South African contradiction. It requires that we explore what it is South Africa has spoken about and continue to discuss things publicly. The anti-apartheid struggle was articulated in the broad strokes that would lead us to a country free of all oppressions and discriminations based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation, language, religion, geographical location, and ability. In this country of the Constitution, from slave resistance, anti-colonial resistance to the Unity Movement, African National Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress, Black Consciousness Movement, the South African Communist Party. All of those aligned with freedom from apartheid, as seen as synonymous with freedom from the burden of race, racist oppression and persecution. Yet the legacy of apartheid continues to be felt by the vast majority of the black poor, who were written out of capital and the most victimized. It's the puzzle. Come on. Unable to verify. Thank you. It also continues to be felt by Black South Africans whose growing impatience with untransformed institutions is becoming increasingly audible in 2015. Although now free from state racism, they feel the effects of mutating oppressive capitalist systems in their workplaces. For those who have such jobs. For the more affluent, race and class still exert control either in the backlash against affirmative action, tokenism, and demonization of black economic empowerment. Untransformed institutions in which white supremacy is again emboldened, or the pressure to participate to be absorbed into a culture of rampant materialism and consumerism. These are problems that continue to haunt us. All of these processes are gendered. Although you may not think so from the bulk of national public discourse, they are a concerted effort to address disparities of race and class. These focus on social transformation and are mindful of the oft-repeated warnings about ensuring that we have both political and economic freedom in a South African democracy. It's important that we continue to ask questions about how this is translated, who is locked out, and how ideas about societal transformation are being narrowed down. I think people take notes for your countries too, because this is not far-fetched to actually apply to yours, especially the US. The discourse in gender in South African public sphere is conservative. They speak of women's empowerment in ways that are never transformative, and as a consequence, existing very comfortably alongside overwhelming evidence that South African women are not empowered. Rape and other gender-based violence statistics, rampant sexual harassments at work and public spaces, the overloaded maintenance of family court, the siege on black lesbians and raging homophobia, the public and relentless circulation of misogynist imagery, metaphors, and language. You have to think about all of these things. When I first offered the bulk of these reflections, I did so as part of the 2006 Ruth First Memorial Lecture, and I wondered out loud what Ruth First, communist, anti-racist, journalist, historian, among many other things, would make of the South Africa she fought for. Asking this question again in 2015 is even more disturbing, and I realize that with all the anger, disappointment, and criticism, I was still much more optimistic in 2006 than I am as I update this essay. What kind of critique might Ruth First have come up with? We know that she did not shy away from having difficult questions, even within the left, and I think she would have found contemporary South African gender talk in need of much critique. Actually, you know what? I am tired. I'm going to stop there. Remember that I have all the linkity links in my link tree. If you are not following me on the Tiki Talkie, please do. I'm on Twitch, YouTube, Discord, and TikTok. And please remember as well that I do these readings for free 3 days a week. So if you can get this goal down, please do. I'm trying very, very hard to keep it together because capitalism sucks. And I'm going to let Fatima up for a few minutes. If y'all can drop gifts to Fatima, that would be very, very much appreciated. Fatima is in Syria. And Salam Habibti. Okay, please, if you can, drop some gifts to Fatima. Yeah, if you can, please subscribe to my Patreon. It's somewhere in the link tree. My coffee and PayPal links are also there as well. Remember to drink water, take your meds, eat something. Remember to smash the motherfucking patriarchy, eat all the white men, and remember to be kind, because everybody deserves kindness, including you. Yes, you do. And if you are food insecure today, let me know, and I shall send you some money from my Tiki Talkie gifts. And if you are on TikTok, please come in. Wa alaikum salam, Habibti. Kif halik? Alhamdulillah, please, I know. All right, so, yeah, if you can do all of those good things, it would greatly help. So I'm going to get off Discord and YouTube now, and I shall see y'all on Tuesday, because, yeah, I'm going to Durban this weekend.